All right, so this will be day two of Unit 5 Energy Systems. So today we're going to be talking about cellular respiration, but specifically going to talk about anaerobic respiration or just the anaerobic process of making energy. So if you remember, whenever we talked about cellular respiration, what we're talking about is we're talking about the process of making ATP and how the mitochondria does that. But we're going to kind of throw a little bit of a hiccup in that. With talking about what anaerobic is. And I do like to switch up because there are two different ways of making ATP. And I do like to do one on one day and one on the next day. So, first things first, let's just know the chemical equation for cellular respiration. So, cellular respiration is effectively the opposite of photosynthesis. So, in cellular respiration, our reactants, what the mitochondria is going to need, it's going to need glucose and oxygen in order to react together, and it ends up producing carbon dioxide, water, and of course our energy. So of course we're not making solar energy, so we are still making an energy, but this time it's ATP. All right, so you will need to make sure that you know the difference between these two. Again, you will have to know products and reactants, type of reaction that's happening, and where it's occurring at. So, cellular respiration, just what is it? Cellular respiration is the breakdown of glucose molecules to release energy, ATP. This process will take place in and around the mitochondria. So, there are two processes. Anaerobic, no oxygen is used, it actually takes place in the cytoplasm. Aerobic, which does use oxygen, is going to take place in the mitochondria. All right. It'll be very important that you know the difference here, and I'm going to kind of give you just a really quick synopsis of the difference in how much energy they produce. Let's think about our daily lives. So, if I were to take you out onto a football field and there was a way that I could sit there and make it to where you couldn't breathe and you had to run a 100-yard sprint, you're probably not going to be able to make the entire 100 yards without breathing at all through your nose or through your mouth. The reason why is because you need so much energy in order to sprint that far that you wouldn't actually be able to make enough energy to move your body that much. But so that would be the way of how your body would go to an anaerobic system, but it wouldn't be producing enough oxygen in order to, or enough energy because of the fact there's not enough oxygen there. But if we switch over to an aerobic system, this is when now you have plenty of oxygen, and I just say, hey, run it. Now you're going to be out of breath at the end of it, but you're going to be able to get that oxygen in, and you're still going to be able to produce energy, produce ATP, and that's what your muscles are going to run on so much. So your muscles have a ton of mitochondria in it, and as you train, you actually increase the amount of mitochondria and their efficiency inside your muscles. All right. So today, though, we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration or anaerobic energy production. So, like we said, anaerobic, no oxygen is required for this process at all. Main point there. It includes glycolysis. So, energy or ATP is produced in different stages. So, anaerobic uses glycolysis. Aerobic uses it as well. And glycolysis just means the breakdown of glucose, because remember, we're going to start with glucose. Glucose is that stored food energy. But then it goes to the stage of fermentation. And the reason why it ferments is because there's no oxygen available to take it inside the mitochondria. You have two types. We have alcoholic fermentation, such as whenever we're talking about, you could take potatoes and get vodka out of it. You could sit there and take grapes and get wine, all that type of stuff. That's fermentation. And then we have lactic acid fermentation. So a really common one of this is what happens in your body whenever you work out really hard and your muscles get really sore and fatigued and tired. That's because of the fact that you weren't always taking in enough oxygen. And so your body was having to kind of figure out, okay, well, We're going to still try to do as much aerobic energy production as possible, but we're probably also going to have to ferment some of this to, well, really to continue moving. Bacteria and yeast are some very common examples. And also, big kicker here is we're only going to produce 2 ATP throughout the whole process. That's we're going to net 2 ATP, okay? Aerobic produces a whole lot more. So this is glycolysis. I know this may look like a really complicated picture, but I'm going to give you something to kind of imagine here. Imagine a field goal post, but turned upside down, to where basically you have one part sticking up in the air, and then you have two that are coming down. Okay? So glycolysis, that's the beginning. That's where we're going to start with glucose. So if you look at this, we have glucose at the very beginning. And the reason why it has 6 circles there is that's representing the 6 carbons. Okay? Now, as it comes down through this process, we do use a little bit of energy, but that's not really that big of a deal. And then it gets split apart into these 2 3-carbon molecules. And then by the end of it, we get what's known as pyruvate. So glycolysis will occur in the cytoplasm. And this is basically what glycolysis is. It's the breakdown of glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Of course, we're only going to have 2 total ATP are going to be produced. And what we mean by that is if you look down here, right above where it says pyruvate, we have 2 ATP there being made, but also on the other side we have 2. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but wait a second, Coach Smith, isn't that 4? But you have to remember we use 2 at the very beginning of the process. So that's why we say we only net 2 ATP. Okay? And that's what's down here in this net part that's in blue at the bottom. We formed 4 ATP, but we had to subtract 2 from that. So we only have 2 ATP. Glucose, 1 glucose molecule is split in half and it's broken into 2 pyruvate molecules. If there is no oxygen, pyruvate undergoes fermentation. Now remember, we are talking about anaerobic respiration, which means there is no oxygen. So that means pyruvate, your body has to have a way of getting rid of it, so it ferments it. Now, if we're talking about your body, then what we're talking about is lactic acid fermentation. If we're talking about bacteria, that's going to be used in the breakdown of fruits and vegetables and things like that, then we'd be talking about alcoholic fermentation. So fermentation, remember, fermentation is going to be an anaerobic process. No oxygen is available for pyruvate, so pyruvate will ferment. 2 types, lactic acid fermentation. This is going to cause animals muscle soreness. You can also, this is how we get yogurt as well. And that's basically taking bacteria and things like that and putting it with milk, with dairy products. Alcoholic fermentation, really common here, yeast. If you're in class, you could actually take, if you're not in class and you want to do this at home, you could take if you have any type of like small vial or anything like that, you could take yeast and sugar water, mix it together, put a balloon on top of it, and you're going to see that balloon expand because carbon dioxide is being produced, and that gas is going to fill it up. And you'll notice is once you take that off and you smell it, it's either going to smell like one of 2 things if you're using yeast. It's either going to smell like bread or it's going to smell like an old beer bottle. Either way it goes, it's fermentation. Okay? So, anaerobic review. I cannot impress upon you enough that of the importance of making sure that you know the difference between anaerobic and aerobic. So you're going to have to really make sure you study over it. On day 3's information, where I actually have a slide made on there that just has the contrasting the 2 of them, and they're side by side. So we will look at that specifically. So you will need to know some of the basic information about cellular respiration, like where it takes place, What the equation is, don't forget, products and reactants. You'll need to know both. How much ATP is produced in anaerobic? Only 2 ATP is produced. Where does glycolysis occur at? It occurs in the cytoplasm. What is produced at the end of glycolysis? Pyruvate. What will happen to that product if no oxygen? Pyruvate will ferment. And then, of course, know the 2 different types of fermentation, alcoholic and lactic acid, and some of that information about it. All right. So next class, what we'll be talking about is aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration.